Hi class, Dr. Jim here. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at immunity. And so I really broke this up into the two types of immunity that we have, the innate immunity and the adaptive immunity. And adaptive is a much more complex system. Innate immunity is just the basic. You have your barriers on the outside, so your skin, your mucous membranes, the chemicals, the tears, the saliva, all those things that help prevent organisms from getting inside of you. And then you have that second line, which is really sitting right underneath the first line of defense. And so you have these white blood cells that are there. You have the process of inflammation, which basically causes you to get the white blood cells to the spot that they need to. And then finally, you have chemical mediators like the interferon, which is chemicals that turn on the immune system, as well as complement, which is kind of this cascade of proteins that go through and help fight this thing. So this one's a really short video. We're just going to talk about the first two lines of defense, and then we're going to spend a lot more time on the adaptive immunity and really just kind of combine the two and do that. And again, I separated this out so it wouldn't be so long and that stuff. So let's take a look at innate immunity. This is something you're born with. This is not something that you have to develop over time like the adaptive. And so that's one of the nice things. And again, most animals have at least innate immunity. Whether you're talking about insects or organisms even lower on the invertebrate scale, all the way up to us. And so innate is something we're born with. And then the adaptive is a more complex type of system that we deal with, especially in humans and other mammals that we see. So let's take a look at the innate immunity today, and then the next video is going to look at the adaptive as we go along. Okay, so again, first we'll talk about innate immunity. I've kind of explained that already a little bit, what innate immunity is. It's something you're born with, and it's your chemical line of defense, your first line of defense, those barriers, and then the second line, which is all the cells, the white blood cells that you have. And then how does innate immunity work in the body? So we'll explain that again. Barriers to keep things out, and then essentially the second line is to fix anything that happened in the first line. And then we'll look at some of the components of the first line of defense. Like I said, those are your physical barriers. Again, your skin, your mucous membranes, the enzymes you produce, some of the other things, sweat glands, all those other things, which are there not only for certain functions, but they're also there for defense as well. And then finally, the second line of defense, which is going to be mostly your white blood cells. And what I'm talking about are the granulocytes that we learned in chapter 34 with the blood, and then the agranulocytes, the monocytes. And so we'll look at those. The B and T lymphocytes, we're going to look at that in the next section. That's going to be the adaptive. And so again, they're important for an adaptive role. The other thing about these two is specificity. So with the adaptive immunity or acquired immunity, that is something you develop over time, and you have very specific cells that target their specific functions to. Whereas with these, it doesn't matter if it's a bacteria, virus, fungus, whatever, in that it's going to respond to it as a foreign agent and destroy. That's kind of their role in the body. They're like basically security guards watching to make sure nothing gets in, and responding when something does. And so that's what we're going to look at here. So again, pathogens are agents that cause disease, infect a wide range of animals, including humans. And again, really we talk about pathogens as any microorganism or organism that causes disease within the humans or other organisms that way. So causing disease or disrupt tissue dysfunction, causing tissue dysfunction or whatever you want to call that, and trigger some of the responses that we see. Now, again, our immune system enables an animal to avoid or limit many infections. And again, all animals have innate immunity, which is a defense that's active immediately upon infection, as well as birth. And so it's one of those things you're born with, and you have these sets of features to keep you safe. The adaptive immunity is something that's only found in vertebrates. And again, it's a more specialized thing, specialized cells that have specificity as well as memory to it. And that's going to be another thing that we'll talk about next time, is memory in these cases. Okay, and so again, the innate immunity includes barrier defenses, and again, it can be small receptor proteins that bind to structures common to viruses, bacteria, and microbes. And again, binding the innate immune receptor activates internal defense responses to a broad range of broad range of pathogens. So if we look at it on the big scale, so innate or natural immunity is non-specific. And so this includes things like your first line of defense, which is the barriers against skin, mucous membranes, the secretions from those mucous membranes, the chemicals like the tears in your eyes have lysozyme to dissolve things. That's why if you get something in your eye, you start to water your eyes to flush it out, as well as provide lysozyme to kill those things. Your earwax in your ear, the mucus, like I said, sweat on your skin, the saltiness, again, to keep pathogens at bay. Also, your normal flora, we don't talk a lot about that as being a defense mechanism, but it does. We know that microbes have can antagonize other microbes, and so when you have a good collection of good microbes there, the bad ones can't grow. And so if they're filling all the spaces, the bad ones can't be there. So if you keep a good normal flora, you're in good shape. And so that's really brought along the last 10, 15 years the whole idea of probiotics, because again, if you get good microflora in your gut and other parts of your body where they're supposed to be, then you keep the pathogens at bay. And so that's all part of the first line of defense. The second line, like I mentioned before, is your innate immune cells, which are mostly or all white blood cells, but not all of the white blood cells. And so again, we'll talk about that again. Inflammation, complement, and then the antimicrobial substances that these cells produce. Okay, and then the acquired and adaptive. This is going to be the other video that I show you. Again, the specialized lymphocytes, the B cells, which produce antibodies. So I'll talk all about that. And then the two types of T cells, the helper T cells, which help activate the system, and then the killer T cells, which basically do the cell killing. And so again, we'll talk about this next chapter, or next lecture, I should say, in that. But for right now, we're just going to focus in on the first and second line of innate immunity. Now, adaptive or acquired develops over exposure, and that it involves a very specific response to pathogens. And so we'll talk about that again in the next section. This is what we're going to look at right now, the innate immunity, which you're born with. And again, I just bring this up now just to show you that there are the two parts of the system. Now, innate immunity is found in all animals and plants. In invertebrates, innate immunity is the immediate response to infections and serves as the foundation of adaptive immunity. And so, again, you have physical barriers and chemical barriers that protect. That's your first line of defense. And so, again, the anatomical barriers, physical and chemical barriers. You have the cells, which include phagocyte cells, which eat things. You have the dendritic cells, which activate and present. And then you have the NK cells and the interleukins and all that good stuff that are there to trigger the immune response. And then you also have soluble proteins like complement, cytokines, chemokines, and antimicrobial substances that all play a role. And this is all released once these cells get activated. And so it's kind of like this double mechanism. You get the cells to activate, they start eating things, and they start producing chemicals, which will then respond in the site of the infection. But again, this only happens when these things get in through the first line of defense. And so you have to have a breach in the first line of defense in order for the second line of defense to start working in this situation. Now, again, in invertebrates, they only have innate immunity. And so, again, typically they rely on their exoskeleton as a physical barrier against infection. Again, their digestive system, the enzyme lysozyme, breaks down bacterial cell walls, protects them from other pathogens, and then the immune cells of insects recognize pathogens by binding to molecules of specific viruses and microorganisms. And each recognition protein of the insect recognizes the broad class of pathogens. And so you have these other cells that respond and block, and they kill. And so you get phagocytosis, you get release of factors that trigger other cells. And again, you see enzymes and lysis and other things that go on to protect. And so again, it's a very simple system, but lots of insects out there. And so we don't really spend a lot of time. They don't have the adaptive immunity that they do, or that we do, but the innate immunity does just enough for their immune system to work and prevent from having major infections and that stuff. And probably some of the reason why insects only have the innate immunity is just the sheer numbers, is that there's just so many of them that it's, even if you lose a few here and there due to infection, it's not a big deal. So you're not going to develop these great immune systems unless you're fewer in number. And so, and that's one of the things that you see in the higher level organisms. You don't have as many offspring, so you're going to have better immune systems to respond to these different types of infections. So I think it's a numbers thing more than anything. Okay. Again, the hemocytes circulate with the hemolymph, and again, remember in insects, that's the one thing, they don't have the blood and that stuff, so these all circulate around in that fluid that, again, is carrying the nutrients and that around the body. They break down, ingest, and break down substances, including bacteria. Then the hemocytes are also release antimicrobial peptides to disrupt the plasma membranes of fungi and bacteria. And again, that's the basics of what we see in our innate immunity, and that we have cells that eat things. Okay, those are the white blood cells that are phagocytic that eat. Those are the neutrophils and monocytes. And then we have the ones that release granules that kill and stimulate the immune system, as well as those that stimulate complement and other things which help destroy these cells. And so again, just kind of give you an idea of what phagocytosis is. Again, that's the eating of these cells by the phagocytic cell. They eat the bacteria, release the lysozyme, that's the enzymes, and then spit it all out. Now, in neutrophils, they tend to just eat and pass it out or spit it out, whereas monocytes will actually take some of these components and put them in a receptor and present them to the third line of defense, which we'll look at next time. So again, just kind of think about that in the back of your mind, that we're going to see the connection of the second and third in the next lecture. Okay, now again, innate immunity of vertebrates. Again, the immune system mammals is the best understood of all vertebrates, and again, these include barrier defenses, phagocytosis, and antimicrobial peptides. Again, natural killer cells, interferons, and inflammatory response are also only seen in vertebrates and not invertebrates. So we have these cells that go in and kill things. We have interferons, which stimulate the immune system. And it's probably because we have the adaptive that they're important. And again, they trigger different types of responses. And then we have the inflammatory response, which is really the body saying, we have an infection, let's do something about it. And again, it helps stimulate the rest of the immune system that we have. Now, barrier defenses, so this is the first line of defense, include things like the skin and mucous membranes, or the respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts, really anything that's open to the outside world. They're around mucous membranes, and again, what they're there for is to secrete mucus, to trap these things, to keep them from getting into where they're supposed to be. And so anywhere you have an opening to the outside world, you're going to have a mucous membrane along there to catch the microbes that are there. And again, mucus traps and allows for the removal of microbes. Many body fluids, including saliva, mucus, and tears, are hostile to many microbes because they contain enzymes like lysozyme, which break down the bacteria and viruses. And then again, our skin has a low pH and the low pH of our digestive system, and so that's another thing that we do. So a lot of things that end up in our lungs, and we'll talk about that, and we talked about this in the respiratory system with the ciliated elevator. What we do is we move this up and then we swallow it in the middle of the night. And so that's why you wake up a lot of times with the little bit of roughness in your throat or the frog in your throat, because again, that's a lot of the stuff you were breathing in the day before that you now swallowed in the middle of the night. And so that's kind of caught in your throat right there. And the reason why we swallow is to get into the acid to get rid of that. And so that's the idea here. And so you can see some of those different things that are there. Now, again, other cellular innate defenses, and this is now the second line of defense after the barriers, so if pathogens get in, we have phagocytic cells that recognize groups of pathogens with these TLRs, which are called toll-like receptors. And these are 9 different receptors. I think it's still 9. There may be more now. But again, they recognize specific things from either bacteria or viruses. And so again, some of the TLRs recognize lipopolysaccharide, which is found in gram-negative bacteria, flagellin, which is part of the flagella. We also have the CpG DNA, which is recognized by TLR9, and then TLR3 recognizes double-stranded RNA, which is found in viruses. And so not only do we recognize bacteria, but we also recognize pieces of viruses. And so we respond to those. When we eat those things, they respond to it and trigger the immune system response. And so that's going to be another thing that we see. Now, the 2 types of phagocytic cells in mammals are the neutrophils and the macrophages. And the neutrophils, again, are really active against bacteria. Think of these as little Pac-Men, because all their job in life is to do is eat things. They go wong, 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 and chomp things up. The other interesting thing that's been out in the last 10, 15 years is that these guys also spit their DNA out kind of like Spider-Man. So what they do is they release their DNA, and it's kind of like a big fishing net. And when the DNA goes out, they have histones on it, and the histones actually have antimicrobial properties. So they trap the DNA in that net, and then they kill the bacteria in there, and then they kind of bring back their DNA and kind of think of that. So think of the neutrophil not only as just eating things, but also think of them as kind of like Spider-Man, where they can shoot their DNA out, trap the bacteria, and then bring it in to eat. And so that's kind of an interesting thing about them. Macrophages, again, where you probably will see these typically a macrophage is outside the blood, but when it's in the blood, we call these monocytes. And so they have two roles. Not only do they eat, and so they're very good at eating like Pac-Man against neutrophil or like neutrophils, but they also then present. And so I wouldn't say they're just active against fungi. I think this is a little simplistic, but I think they're also very active against bacteria and viruses because they're important because they're kind of that in between the second and third line of defense. So these are what are also known as antigen presenting cells because they present pathogens to the T cell saying, I ate this, we got to do something about this. Or they present this to the B cell and said, I ate this, let's do something about it. And so they're going to be really important gateway between the second and third line. And again, we'll talk more about that next time in the next lecture. Now, the other cells that we have are these dendritic cells. Again, they're called dendritic cells because they kind of look like a neuron. They have this big cell body, and then they have these dendrites that come off of them that are used to kind of trap and activate. And so they stimulate development of adaptive immunity and contact with the environment, that contact the environment like the skin. And so again, they're kind of these important mediators between the second and third line of defense because when they trap things, they then can present and show these to the T cells and the B cells. And then the eosinophils discharge destructive enzymes. Again, these are primarily for eukaryotic parasites. So if you ever want to know if you have a parasite, have the doctor or the nurse do a blood count. If you're high in eosinophils, so if you're high in neutrophils, you have a bacterial infection. If you're high in eosinophils, your blood count, normally these are very low, less than 1% in your blood. If it's higher than 2 or 3%, that probably means you have a eukaryotic parasite. Probably means you either have a worm or some other type of eukaryote going on, and these eosinophils are responding to the infection. So that's one way you can tell if you have a parasite, either a worm or an intracellular parasite or something like that, that's kind of floating around, and you look for your eosinophils. And so again, they have granules that release and they go and kill and do a good job of killing by releasing these enzymes and that cause destruction. Now, another type of cell that we have is called the natural killer cells, and they circulate throughout the body to detect abnormal cell. And what they do is they go after cells that are infected with a virus. And so again, these are adaptive, or these are innate because again, they're not specific, but they'll look for cells that are in trouble. And so when the cells are in trouble, they go in, they release enzymes and actually kill the cells. So they're looking for cells that are infected with viruses or intracellular parasites that go in and kill the cell from the inside out. And so again, they release chemicals causing cell death, and they spread virtually infected or virally infected or cancer cells. So they're going to play a real important role with cancer as well. And again, a lot of these things you're going to see is the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system, remember, is the drainage. We're going to talk more about that in the adaptive because it's really important with the B and T cells. But think about this. These cells are also there looking at the fluid getting returned back to the heart. And if there's anything there that's not supposed to be there, these guys respond. And so that's what you see there. Now, some of the other proteins and peptides that we have include recognitions that attack pathogens and impede their reproduction. One of the things are interferons, which provide innate defense with interfering viruses, and they help activate macrophages. And they also kind of send out the warning signal to other cells. If a cell is being infected by a virus, a lot of times they'll send out interferons and say, hey, I'm being infected, kind of the silent alarm, triggering other cells to either start making defenses or signaling the macrophages or NK cells to come eat me because I'm not going to make it and I need some help. The other thing we have is the complement system, and this is a group of about 30 proteins, and you can see they're labeled C1 through 9 in this situation. You have a couple different pathways, and typically it is either activated by antibodies, which are produced by the B cells that stimulate it, or again, a lot of times you'll see it where you get activation through innate immunity. And again, this is a series of proteins that cause cell lysis. So you can see cell lysis. So what happens to the bacteria cells is it actually pokes holes. And we'll look at this again later on, where it pokes holes in the cells. So it puts these proteins in the membrane and causes the membranes to become leaky. It can lead to inflammation, again, leading to immune cell recognition and immune cells coming into the site of infection. And then it can also do opsonization, which targets antibodies to bind to the cell and flag it, say, kill this. And so we'll see that as well, especially with the adaptive. And so activation can lead to the lysis of invading cells. So it's another innate system that you have that are just there to kill, kill, kill. So not only the phagocytes and that, but you also have these proteins that are there to respond and start killing the cells. Now, another important thing that we have is called the inflammatory response. And so, such as pain and swelling is brought by molecules released upon injury or of the infection. And so, again, this allows for the cells to come out. And like I said, blood vessels are leaky. So when I talked about this, capillaries are leaky, and the reason why they're leaky is so that these white blood cells can get to where they need to go. And so there's chemical mediators that say, hey, we got an infection going on, especially if you have some break in the tissue or first line of defense. These things get in. These cells leave the blood vessel, so they either work their way through the cell or through the cell gap junctions, and they leak out into the system. And this is where the fluid comes in. So when we think about the inflammatory response, typically we get heat, redness, swelling, and pain. The heat is due to the vasodilation, and that again brings out more white blood cells to the site of the infection. The redness is again due to the vasodilation and again the leakiness of the blood, so the redness, the heat, also raising the temperature to kill the microbes because again microbes can be temperature sensitive. You get the leakiness, so you get swelling, which is the extracellular fluid. So the vessels leak out the fluid as well, and so you get swelling where that tissue is damaged. And then finally, you get pain because that swelling and the vasodilation and all that hits the little nerves that are basically pain receptors that respond to pain. And so that's why you're typically with the four things of inflammation is redness, swelling, pain, and heat. Those are the four classical signs. I'll do that again. Heat, redness, swelling, and pain. So those are the things, and that's due to, again, the things being released and becoming into the site of the infection. So we see that going on. And again, the enhanced blood flow delivers the antimicrobial peptides. It results in the accumulation of pus, which is a rich in white blood cells, dead pathogens, and cell debris from damaged cells. And so again, pus is a good thing because that means your cells are eating these things up and spitting them out and killing the stuff. So a lot of times you'll see, especially with a skin scrape in that, you may get some oozing and stuff. That's good because that means your cellular response is working well. It means you're getting the destruction of those cells, the pathogens, as well as the surrounding tissue and that. And so that's a good thing that's going on there. And so, like I said, you may get swelling due to that increased amount of extracellular fluid and the pain that goes along with it, not only due to the injury, but also due to the extra fluid and cells in there hitting the pain receptors. And so you see that as well. Now, inflammation can be either local or systemic throughout the body. And again, systemic is not normally a good thing. You want it localized because it's good for fighting in a localized infection. If it's going systemic, then you tend to have more problems. Now, one of the responses that's triggered is fever. And like I said, bacteria and pathogens tend to be temperature sensitive. So fever can be a good thing. So when you have a low grade fever, that means your body's responding to something that's not supposed to be there, and that's normal. But when the fever gets too high, and again, this is when it's too much of a good thing, that can cause problems because then we can have cell problems, our own issues with getting too high of a temperature. And then that's when you want to seek medical treatment. But if you have a low grade fever, sometimes just keep the Advil off to the side. If you can deal with it and that stuff and you know you're feeling it, it's your body's natural way to fight these infections by raising the temperature to kill these bacteria. Now, there is something called septic shock. This is really when the body just gets all overwhelmed. It's just like, it's kind of like you if you had a lot to do and you don't even know where to start. And so it just piles up and you get so frustrated and so overwhelmed that you're just like, I can't do anything because I just don't know what to do. And that's what the body does. So when you get this infection that starts triggering everything at once, the body just doesn't know how to respond and says, it goes, I don't know what to do, and it just shuts down. And so that can be bad. And so that's what happens when you get this overwhelming infection due to an overwhelming inflammatory response. So it's the body going too high and too much of, again, a systemic response to an infection. And so that can be bad as well. And then we hear a lot about chronic inflammation, and again, that can be a threat to human health. And so again, inflammation can be good because you can get progressive healing. And again, things like chemical irritants, frostbite, cuts and lacerations or stabbing, trauma, allergic reactions, burns, and infection, these are all good things because it can trigger healing. But if you have long-term inflammation, it can be bad as well. So it can lead to cardiovascular disease, again, causing inflammation, especially in the vessels, which can lead to fatty deposits, exposure of smooth muscle, and other things that can lead to, again, coronary artery disease. Some people have sought that inflammation may lead to autism, so inflammation in the brain can trigger those responses, or maybe during pregnancy and development. Rheumatoid arthritis, we know this is due to allergic responses in that. Autoimmune disease is progressive inflammation where the body starts attacking itself. Neurological disease, so things like MS and other things where the immune system starts to attack the immune system, or not the immune system, but the nervous system, and so it wears away at the myelin fibers. Alzheimer's is one of those things that, again, they think is due to inflammation of the nervous system, and then cancer as well, because again, you get this outgrowing of cells, a lack of response or surveillance, and so that can lead to problems as well. So inflammation can be good, but too much of a good thing can be bad. And so again, we want to keep this in check. And so we've heard about these things now, people having chronic inflammation. And again, there's a lot of drugs that lower that inflammation. A drug like Humira, which a lot of people are now taking for things like Crohn's disease and other things, which are all autoimmune diseases. And it's when the immune system is working too well or overacting and causing problems. And another one like that is allergies. So when you have allergies and everything else, and you get too oversensitive, you go into anaphylactic shock, and that can be too much of a good thing. Again, more of a systemic response than just a localized response. Okay, and then again, evasion of the innate immunity by pathogens. And so adaptations have evolved in some pathogens that allow them to get into phagocytes. And so you can see here is a list of either bacteria or some parasitic fungi or parasites, eukaryotic parasites that have worked their way in. And so what they do is they say, yeah, go ahead and eat me up. But what they can do is then survive infection and destruction. And so then they get transferred to other parts of the body, either by the monocytes, or they live in the monocytes protected from the rest of the immunity. So they kind of trick the system and hide by living inside the immune cells. So these guys have gotten smart in that stuff. And again, we know a number of different bacteria and viruses and other pathogens, eukaryotic pathogens, that can do this as well. And again, you can see that where it again provides blocking of those things. And so it doesn't get in, doesn't get eaten, or prevents blocking, or if they do get in, they can go and hide. And so that's the other thing as well. And then they can escape later on. So, okay, just an idea of avoiding phagocytosis as well. All right, very short video, like I said. So the innate immunity is very easy. First line of defense, second line of defense. First line is your barriers, so your physical and chemical barriers to keep you protected. So that would be your skin, your mucous membranes, and the chemicals we produce on the outside. Think of any opening to the outside world as a way for a pathogen to get in. So your mouth, your nose, your ears, your eyes, your butt, again, rips in the skin, things like that. Those are going to be protected. And so the areas that I talked about, the mouth, the nose, the ears, the eyes, the butt, the urogenital system, those all have mucous membranes to trap and collect those things. So the mucous membranes are important because not only do they secrete mucus to trap microorganisms, but they also produce chemicals that destroy those as well. Okay, and so that's important. Second thing is the second line of defense. Those are really the white blood cells and the chemicals that they produce, along with some of the other proteins that we have intracellularly. Now, I wouldn't say intracellularly, but extracellularly, that will respond to the pathogens. And again, this all leads up to the third line of defense, which we're going to talk about next time. And again, what we looked at was the first and second line of defenses. We found in both plants and animals that have innate immunity. And again, as you work your way up, you get more specialized immune systems and more of a third line of defense, which we'll talk about next time. Again, we're born with these defenses. There's no specificity. So again, doesn't matter if it's a virus or a bacteria, it's going to recognize it, or what type of virus or bacteria. It's just going to go and attack. And again, we talked about the first and second lines and what they are. And again, there are pathogens that can escape these defenses. And so for higher vertebrates, like I said, we have an adaptive line, which we're going to talk about next time. And with that, we've talked about innate immunity. Hopefully you got a better understanding about that. If you do have questions about innate immunity and what it does or how it works or anything, please send me an email or we'll talk about it in class. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.